Thank you so much for having me. So my talk today is based on this paper, Decarbonizing the U.S. Economy, that I wrote with Mark Paul and Josh Mason at the Roosevelt Institute. And so if you Google it, you can find a much longer version of what I'm going to say, and probably some things that I left out entirely. But this is our paper, and I'm excited to talk to you about the Green New Deal today. So I think the Green New Deal is a response to two separate crises in this country. One of them, of course, is the climate crisis that I suppose all of you are very aware with. So I have almost no slides on it besides these two images from the IPCC report, looking at what we need to do if we want to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius, which might not be a goal we can even reach, but if we want to do it, right, we need to bring emissions down to zero very, very quickly. Right? Even if we want 2 degrees of warming, we need to bring them down very quickly. So the climate crisis, I think, is immense, and I suspect all of you know more about it than me. The other side of the problem, I think, is that we have an inequality crisis. And this is made very clear in the Yellow Vest movement in France, protesting, among other things, an increase in gas prices in France. Because an increase in gas prices especially harms, costs those who are least well off in society, right? It's a regressive tax, and we saw that when we try to meet our climate goals in a regressive way, in a way that exacerbates inequality, you're going to get people in the streets, and we're not going to be able to do something about it. So into this space, these two crises, we have this case for a Green New Deal. How many of you seen this video that AOC and folks put together online? If you haven't, you should Google it and watch the video. I think it's fairly inspiring. It's trying to link together, right, a movement that's both making a better economy for the vast majority of us and meeting our climate goals. There's a much more humorous version. Also on YouTube, you can Google this, and you've seen that as well. Also a good synopsis, I guess, of where we're going. But I think what's interesting is the Green New Deal is surprisingly popular among people. So this is a poll from Data for Progress, which in February asked a bunch of Americans. They said, some Democrats in Congress are proposing a Green New Deal bill, which would phase out the use of fossil fuels, with the government providing clean energy jobs for people who can't find employment in private sector. All jobs would pay at least $15 an hour, include health care benefits and collective bargaining rights. This would be paid for by raising taxes on incomes over $200,000 a year by 15 percentage points. And then they say, Democrats say this would improve the economy by giving people jobs, fight climate change, and reduce pollution to the air and water. Republicans say it would cost many jobs in the economy's energy sector, hurt the economy by raising taxes, and wouldn't make much of a difference because of carbon emissions from China. Right? Do you support or oppose this policy? And what we see is in the United States in general, most people support it. And Colorado is one of the blue states here. Wyoming to our north, most people do not support it. But in most states in this country, people are saying, yeah, I would support that sort of move. NPR and Marist more recently had a poll where they asked a bunch of things, and we see that a Green New Deal is about as popular as providing a pathway to citizenship or legalizing cannabis, the first two lines in this slide. And it's significantly more popular than rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement or adopting a carbon tax. Right? So right now, a Green New Deal sells to people in a way that these other two policies don't. Although, I mean, obviously there's some confusion here among voters, since presumably a Green New Deal would help us meet our Paris Climate Agreement goals, and perhaps a tax on carbon would be one piece of that Green New Deal. But something about framing this as part of a new deal, as part of a new sort of economic vision for this country, gets support in places that we don't see support for other policies to reduce emissions. So I think it's something that we should take seriously to think about. That said, I think a Green New Deal is kind of poorly defined so far. And this isn't really a criticism of those pushing for it. The resolution that the AOC and others have put forward, it's a resolution, right? It's not a detailed bill. And the sort of plans we're seeing from some presidential candidates and now are still relatively rough. And that's as it should be at this point. The New Deal itself, I mean, the original New Deal was also a broad set of ideas that was fought over bill after bill after bill, right? So there's no reason this doesn't need to be, or this is going to, we'd expect it to be any different in this case. That said, what I want to do in this talk is sort of lay out a case for, an economic case for what I think would make up a good part of a Green New Deal. And here we're focusing on the sorts of policies we need to bring emissions down to zero, to decarbonize the economy. And we're sort of setting aside for now some of the other policies that might actually be what excites people about a Green New Deal around federal job guarantee, or those sorts of broader policies that are sometimes wrapped up with the Green New Deal.
So
You'll take the bait.
So do you think that the Green New Deal is very popular right now because it's poorly defined?
I think
It could be whatever you like.
I think that's. I suspect that's part of it. I mean, I'm not a polling expert, so I'm not sure, but I think that might be part of it. Yeah. I think it's also partly popular because a lot of the people who support it also want sort of more radical structural changes in economic policy generally. And I think it's popular in part because it's tied together with those policies, which I'm admittedly going to abstract from in this talk. All right. So our paper provides sort of a framework for why we need a broad solution to climate change. And we propose three pillars of sort of climate policy. One that we're putting forward is a carbon dividend, which is probably the most broadly supported among economists, but isn't actually that popular with people, perhaps because they don't understand it, but perhaps for other reasons. Regulation, we think, unlike a lot of economists, we think there's a strong role for regulation on top of carbon pricing. And we're going to make the case specifically for carbon neutral building codes and electric vehicles mandate. So these are just some of the specific policies that are in the package that I'm going to present today. And then we think there's a separate case for public investment, right, above and beyond both pricing and regulation. And I'm going to briefly discuss investment in retrofitting existing buildings and expanding mass transit. And building a high-capacity national grid. Forgot my slides. No, this is not all things I actually didn't get to. Paying farmers to capture carbon, which is something that we should talk to you about later. Expanding federal R&D, and directing credit to green businesses. I'm only going to really get into the first two of these, however. But if you go to the paper, you'll see all of this. So we want to make the case that carbon dividends, so pricing, regulation and public investment, really we should think of them as complements and not substitutes. So the economic case for a carbon dividend, how many of you have already heard of carbon dividends, the idea of a carbon dividend? Great. So this is a slide from my Econ 240 course that I met Moses in. But if you imagine sort of a demand curve for carbon emissions, right? You think about something like this, where as you reduce the amount of tons of CO2 you're producing, you're going to have to pay people more and more money to decide to do that, right? Right now, we're producing roughly 6 billion tons, and this number is almost entirely theoretical, but it works out well if you think that this is a straight line, which it's obviously not, but again, this is from my introductory economics course. The main thing to get is that if we tax carbon at something like $200 per ton, right? In the short to medium run, we should expect to reduce emissions by something like a quarter. Right? That's roughly what economists think. We don't know for sure, but that's roughly what we think would happen if you put a price of $200 per ton of carbon or about $2 per gallon of gasoline. That you would reduce in a short run gasoline consumption by also roughly a quarter, maybe a little bit more. Now, the abatement cost for people is $150 billion, right? That means that's sort of the cost of just adjusting our behaviors in order to reduce our emissions by that amount, like hopping on your bike instead of not, or turning down your thermostat a little bit in the winter and turning on the AC a little bit in summer and wearing that uncomfortable sweater a little bit more. All those sorts of things that you would do if you were facing a $200 per ton tax. this is the total cost to you. The important thing to understand about a carbon dividend is that all this money is money that would be raised by a carbon tax. Roughly $1 trillion a year, right? We're talking about a huge amount of money that the government would be bringing in with this sort of tax. So the question is, what do you do with that money? And what a carbon dividend, the idea behind a carbon dividend is that you give everybody the same lump sum value back. Sometimes every adult, sometimes just every person. I would tend to prefer every person so that kids would get the dividend as well, since families in this country tend to be overburdened as is.
Or some age in between.
You could choose any age, of course. So in a slightly different, so this is a theoretical $200 tax I used for my class. In a paper I wrote for the People's Policy Project, Disrupting the Dirty Economy, Mark Paul and I calculate that a tax of $230 per ton, so just a little bit more, could fund a dividend of about $2,200 per person. So we'd pay about $2.30 extra per gallon of gasoline, and every individual, including children, could receive $2,200 in a lump sum. Right? That's the idea. So what this figure is showing you is that that tax rate would raise the price of gasoline by about 79%, electricity by about 51%, airfare by about 23%, and so on. We would pay extra when we're buying all things that have carbon emissions embodied in them, but then we get $2,000 in a lump sum back. And what that does is it makes the policy progressive. So the important thing to understand on a carbon tax is that, first of all, the rich are going to pay more than the poor in a carbon tax. That's what you see, the cost in dollars per person. If you're in the richest decile, you're going to pay almost $5,000 per person with a tax of that magnitude. Whereas if you're in a poorest decile, you're going to pay less than $1,000. Right? That's because rich people pollute about 5 times as much as poor people in this country. They buy more things, have bigger cars, and so on. But as a percentage of income, the burden is actually, it's regressive. So as a percentage of income, right, that's the dark green, the poor would be paying almost 15% of their income in higher prices, whereas the rich would be paying less than 10% of their income. Right? So a carbon tax by itself is a regressive policy, which is part of the reason that you see the yellow vest protests in France and so on. A carbon dividend changes that into a progressive policy. So this is showing if we gave everybody $2,237 per person, then what would their net benefit be? Well, if you're in the bottom decile, you would get the $2,237. The black then is what you would pay in higher prices, and the green is how much you'd come out ahead. So on average, folks in the poorest decile would come out ahead about $1,300. And in fact, the bottom 6 deciles would all come out slightly ahead. The 7th decile would lose out just a bit, and the 10th decile, folks in the richest 10% of the United States, would each be a little over $2,000 worse off than they used to be, but they're sort of the folks who can afford it in the first place.
Makes too much sense.
It makes too much sense, yeah. So this is the case for a carbon dividend. How many of you feel like that's sort of a okay policy, an okay way to go? Okay, so I won't spend too much time trying to convince you. I got the idea from Jim Boyce, one of my professors at UMass Amherst, political economist, decidedly to the left of the spectrum. But it's something that's been supported by a bunch of conservative economists too. And recently, just this year, over 3,500 economists, including myself, signed the statement in support of a carbon dividend, which is actually a big deal because although almost all economists support carbon pricing, a lot of them wanted to use the money instead to pay down debt, to reduce marginal tax rates for reasons we don't need to discuss. But they finally got around to, hey, equity matters enough that we support a dividend even though it's slightly inefficient. So we won't go through over all that. There's also some, a bit of a movement behind this policy. Are any of you members of CCL, the Citizens Climate Lobby? Okay, so there's some people who are pushing for this as well, and I think it's got 1 Republican that supports the bill right now. But 2. All right, so we doubled. So I mean, there is some movement here, and CCL is I'm giving some talk for CCL on this in like a month or so in Boulder. So I think this is an important part of a Green New Deal, and we shouldn't forget it.
And have you seen any studies about the efficacy of it in British Columbia?
Well, the tax rates are still so low that it's not doing much, because if you tax carbon at $20 or $30 or $40 a ton, we wouldn't expect much to happen. That's another confusion, I think. I mean, I think some of the excitement around Green New Deal is like, look, this carbon pricing isn't doing anything. And that's true, but most of the carbon, I mean, not doing much, but most of our carbon pricing has also been so minimal. It's not, I mean, what Jim Boyce would say is that's not a case against carbon pricing. That's a case for a higher price, right? Okay, I've got a few more things to say, and then we'll open up to everything. There's also, I think, a strong case for regulations on top of the carbon pricing. So really, what economists are thinking, in this idealized world of economic models, all we need to do is price carbon, and everything else works out automatically. But the actual economy is a lot more complicated. It's characterized by what we economists call imperfections, but it includes things like bounded rationality, the effect that we don't actually fully incorporate the cost of gasoline into what vehicle we purchase. Asymmetric information, where you just literally can't even find out, right, the efficiency of different things until you own them, homes, cars, and so on. Economies of scale, where often it's going to be cheaper for us to reduce emissions when we do it collectively than when we each individually decide to do it because it passes some personal benefit cost analysis. And coordination problems that make it difficult to actually reduce emissions unless other people are doing the same thing. Right, you can think of like bicycling, which is a great thing for individuals to do, but it's easier to do when a lot of people already cycle. Right, it's hard to be the only bicycle on the road. So regulations can often be cheaper and more effective than pricing in these sorts of cases. And you can think of things like technology mandates. Right, it's not like when we adopted catalytic converters, we said, oh no, we shouldn't have a catalytic converter, let's just price CO, right, carbon monoxide correctly, and let people decide if they want to purchase a catalytic converter in the car. It's cheaper just to put them on every car. We don't let people make that decision, right? Corporate average fuel economy standards, you can think of somewhat similarly, right? The fact is, we have solid evidence that when people go to the parking lot and look at how much it's going to cost, how much they're going to spend in gasoline and so on, they undervalue that into the car. They're happier buying a cheaper car up front than investing more in the car up front and saving money on the back end. So regulations in those cases make sense because, you know, we're a little bit stupid. I think there's economists tend to think people are really, really smart. So I think that provides sort of an argument for carbon neutral building codes. So right now buildings account for something like 40% of emissions, but investments in energy efficiency only pay off over the very long run. So, you know, we have systems like LEED and Energy Star to try, as some of you I imagine are involved in this sort of thing. And we have evidence that voluntary certification increases the rent, for example, on commercial properties. But builders and landlords are still most of them are still underinvesting in energy efficiency. So by 2025, we argue that new buildings should meet high energy efficiency standards, which would need your expertise in what they should be in different regions of the country and so on. Rely entirely on electric power. I mean, at some point we need to stop bringing new gas lines and so on to new developments. It'll take us a little bit longer to phase out the gas lines to existing homes. And be accessible by green transportation, right? It doesn't make sense for us to be building new neighborhoods that are only accessible by private vehicles. Right? So this is the sort of regulation we think makes sense. California recently passed legislation that all new developments need to have rooftop solar. They actually had a compromise, and they allow still for gas to be brought into these homes. That was a compromise that developers insisted upon. But I think it provides a good example of why it's better to do this through regulation than through pricing, right? Of course, you could raise the price of carbon enough that a lot of us would individually call up a solar company and have them come put solar panels on our home. But how much less does it cost for a solar company to come and do it for every home on a block, right? Wow. It's just cheaper. It costs a lot less?
No, it costs a lot less.
It costs a lot less, right? Because you just start rolling through them in the same way that people roll through, you know, putting the roofs on all these homes and so on. It's just cheaper. It makes more sense to do this together than to do it apart, which is not a case for not doing it right now in your old home. You should, but our new development should have things like this. We don't need individuals to demand a more energy efficiency home. We just need to get developers to build all more energy efficient homes. Right, for at least new homes. So that's a clear case, I think, for regulations. So transportation's another 30% of emissions. And investments in EVs, I think, are going to pay off in the long run, right? They're simpler to maintain. But we need to start converting quickly because the average vehicle is on the road for 11 years, which means every gas combustion engine right now that we're selling, every new one is still, I mean, unless we retire them early, is going to be running for years. Buyers are underinvesting up front, which makes electric cars unattractive. But EV statutes are spreading. So California requires 8% EVs by 2025. That's not a huge amount, but it's something. Norway is trying to get to 100% EVs by 2025. So that's more ambitious.
And 40% now.
And 40% now of new sales, right? We're talking about new sales. So we propose a federal mandate that increases the market share of EVs over time so that we reach 100% by 2030, right? So it's not, I mean, it's much more than, say, California is doing right now, but it's still slower than Norway is suggesting. I mean, this is arguably, I think it's a reasonable sort of thing that we could do.
When you say we, does that mean the Green New Deal?
I meant we, the people who live in this country and share it together. Yeah.
Oh, right.
No, I did mean the whole country, not just a state. I mean, a state could do it, but I think it's easier to do. I mean, again.
It has been decided.
Well, nothing's been decided.
So that's 100% of new sales by 2020?
Yeah, that's our proposal. I think it's a reasonable thing that we could get done, but we can discuss that too.
You gotta see all the forces behind electric vehicles that are coming together all at once to make it happen, the price of solar.
Yeah, well, I mean, and if you mandate it, it is, I mean, so this figure is trying to show you how great mandates are sometimes. So this is the grams of carbon dioxide per mile over time. You see when we first adopted the CAFE standards, we reduced emissions, or we reduced CO2 emissions by almost 50% within just a few years. But you also have actually some price. The price of gasoline went up there too, so there was some complementary effect. Then we had the slow run up when we did nothing between 1985 and 2008, and then another reduction under Obama, which now we might phase out. But I mean, these mandates sort of can work. We have the technology for EVs. I don't see any reason over the course of 10 years. I mean, that might be too slow, but over the course of 10 years, it seems reasonable to me that everything is an EV, all new vehicles.
You've heard the argument that there are some supply chain constraints on EVs. How do you respond to that?
Like batteries and so on,
yes.
or what? Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I do not know the details, and I think figuring out how to make batteries recyclable and not a huge liability, a decade down the road is extremely important. I hope people are thinking about that better than me. But I don't see an alternative. I mean, maybe we need many fewer cars on the road too, but I think the cars that are on the road that are new need to be electric by then. This is my hunch. And finally, there's a strong case for public investment. So public spending is necessary because often alternatives to carbon-intensive economy require economies of scale. They're things that we can't do individually, that we need to do collectively. There are coordination problems that can only be solved through public investment. And public investment can be financed in part through a financial transaction tax, for example, a wealth tax, progressive income tax, and so on. So we can fund a lot of this. There's a lot of money up in the top of the distribution now that most people supporting a Green New Deal would be happy to tax. But there's also a strong case for financing some of this through deficit spending. So the unemployment rate is 3.8%, which seems very low, but the labor force participation is still 2 points below where it was at its height. So that's what this figure is showing you, labor force participation among the whole population and among folks 25 to 54. Where the dotted lines are showing you the historical maximum. So between the dotted line and where we are, you have 3 points. Suggesting there's still a lot of people out there actually that dropped out of the labor force that could potentially be pulled back in if we had a more high pressure economy. Yes?
People really would rather just have an income. They aren't necessarily interested in working. Many of us retired folks are very happy not working.
Yeah, well, I'm not trying to employ the retired folks, but
Point out something
yeah.
is that there's other ways than just making everybody work.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying we had to make everyone work, but we're saying that sort of deficit spending, to the extent that Keynesian economics and fiscal expansion works, is there are still some people sitting on that would like to work that we pull into the labor force every day. Well, I mean, this data suggests it, right? This is suggesting, I mean, what, the people wanted to work in 2008, but they don't want to work anymore? That seems relatively implausible to me. And I think, I mean, look, like the low end of the labor market, especially in this country, pays so little that there are people, I think, who aren't employed in it right now just because wages are almost nothing. I mean, you can hardly survive. No, I think that a higher pressure economy would employ people that aren't employed now. So that would be one case for some deficit spending. You know, wages are stagnant, essentially. I mean, they haven't gone up for people at the low end of the distribution for decades, essentially. That suggests that we need more macroeconomic pressure. Inflation is below target. The output gap is roughly 10% of GDP. So what that is if you look at the trend line that we were on before the 2008 financial crisis, which is the smooth line, and the jagged line, you see previous crises, we caught up to the trend after the crisis. The most recent crisis, we haven't caught up to the trend. There's about 10% difference now, suggesting that a lot of productive capability of this economy isn't even being used. Right? Another way of looking at it is this is the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and this is all the revisions to what potential GDP is over the years, right? So the highest up line is what they were estimating back in 2002. And every year they're like reducing what they think the potential of the economy is. That doesn't make very much sense unless what we have is insufficient demand. So this is a little figure showing what would happen if we increase deficit spending by 4% of GDP. 4% of GDP would be like $800 billion annually, which is, you know, a lot of money. What would happen? Well, if we were in business as usual, right? If we just did what we're doing now, then our deficit, our debt is going to climb to about 100% of GDP, not quite, 95% of GDP by 2050. With 4% deficit spending for 10 years, we come up here and that slowly backs back down based on current interest rates and inflation and growth. And if you think actually there's some slack in the economy, the full effect is going to be less than what the highest line suggests. If 1 point of $1 billion of spending increases GDP by $500 million, right, this would be the 4% deficit with hystereses, we could expand government spending by $800 billion a year for 10 years, and we'd still have a debt to GDP ratio in 2050 of something like just over 100% of GDP. Which, to put that in context, you know, Japan has had a debt to GDP ratio of about 200% for decades now. And it doesn't seem like that's Japan's particular problem.
So what I don't understand is what is this deficit spending for? What is it being spent on?
Yes, so we're going to get to that. But I want you to first relax sort of the idea that we don't have any money to pay for these sorts of things. So there are two specific programs that I want to sort of push, investments, but there are more on the paper. One would be expanding mass transit. So our carbon-based transportation system is 30% of emissions, right? It costs government about $200 billion a year right now for roads, which is, you know, a lot of money. And it costs us households about $1 trillion for vehicles every year, right? So that also is a lot of money. And of course, vehicles are idle about 96% of the time. So like our current system is extremely wasteful. It's expensive and wasteful. Moses?
So we talked about this, but there's also like Google and Waymo and all these other companies working on AI.
Yeah.
Driverless cars.
Mm-hmm.
Is that playing any of the efficiencies that is lacking?
Yeah, actually, we're going to pull in that in just a second. And we have got a lot of congestion, right? What we know is that transit moves way more people per hour than other modes of transportation. I mean, more than walking, more than biking, and a lot more than cars. Because cars just take up an enormous amount of space for usually moving one person around. Right? So mass transit plus EVs plus ride sharing, and I guess plus, you know, autonomous vehicles when we get them, especially if we stick some people together, would in essence reduce emissions by something like 80%. You know, our cities might look more like this relative to that. Sorry, relative to, oh, it's further back, sorry. But you know, our cities, it's relative to what our cities look like now. And it would cost less than business as usual, but it would need some investments up front, right? So public investments could, for example, easily replace the $18 billion that we currently have in fares. So all the fares for mass transit in the United States now are less than $20 billion a year. To me, that's pretty low-hanging fruit. Like, you know, we're already running the buses and the subways and so on. Let's make sure they're full. Maybe increase the number of buses. But replacing those fares is easy. We should be electrifying the systems that we have. Electrifying mass transit in general is going to be easier than electrifying cars. We won't need as many batteries. And we should expand capacity and build more systems, right? The idea essentially is what we'd like to do is make decarbonized transit people's first best option for getting from point A to point B, right? That's sort of the goal. Our cities might have to look a lot more like this, right? We might have to have, you know, I'm thinking of like, you know, little trains running through all the big streets every mile by mile in our grid here in Fort Collins, right? Free trains. And a second, I think, investment that, again, I think some of you would know way more about than me would be building a high-capacity national grid. That's 30% of our emissions. But 100% renewable electricity is relatively low-hanging fruit, right? That's what a carbon price would kind of get you quickest, in a way. We know a carbon price or a renewable portfolio standard work to move us over to renewable energy if it's a sufficiently high price or ambitious RPS. But there's a case for moving this electricity around. We're already starting to see that in some places, right? The sun rises and sets in different parts of the country. The wind patterns are negatively correlated across space. So moving electricity from one place to another is really useful. We have this sort of duck curve in California, where there's already a lot of solar energy that's bringing down what they need in the middle of the day quite a lot. And if they keep on adding to that solar, at some point they're going to get to where that energy is essentially free if we can move it somewhere that can use it, right? An $80 billion high-capacity national grid would link our grids, which there we have 3 major ones, but it sounds to me from talking to people that they're even 5, and even within the grids, not all that well connected.
Leave Texas out.
Leave Texas out. It would reduce the need for storage to move electricity around, and it would pay for itself, according to folks at NREL, with a really low carbon price of like $20 per ton. But it would require federal funding to get done. It's exactly the sort of project that's better for the federal government to fund than to try to get, you know, companies to invest in it for some long-term, uncertain future. So, in conclusion, I think averting the catastrophic climate crisis requires rapid decarbonization. And so our framework is built on dividends, so pricing carbon emissions and using that money in an equitable way. Regulating things that make more sense to regulate, and investing in those things that can reduce the bottlenecks. We think that a case for a Green New Deal is particularly strong given sort of the weak state of the macroeconomy, given the fact that there are still people who are not working since 2008, and that wages have not really gone up for a lot of folks in this country for decades. I think if you want to join the fight for a Green New Deal, you know, we have our representatives we can work through, and Joe's on board, and Michael's kind of a maybe, and Corey's a no, so do what you want with that. But I think it's also, I think that the nice thing about Green New Deal is you can also think about, you know, what are the local plans, right? The Green New Deal is a vision, but the number of bills and the legislation we need is really, we need at the local, the state, and the national level. One possible proposal that I've been suggesting to people here in Fort Collins is that we should have free mass transit, right? So right now, according to my very cursory view of the budget, mass transit costs us something like $18 million a year. Fares plus some donation from Bohemian Foundation, I don't really know about, seem to equal $600,000 a year. It looks to me like the fares already cover a negligible amount of what it costs us to run mass transit. Like, why do we have machines and people who are checking to see who paid? Like, we're running the buses, let's get people on the buses. Cities all around the world are making mass transit free. We let people drive on our roads for free, even though they're costing us a bunch of money, right? And burdening our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I think there's a strong case for that sort of policy at the local level. And so I'll leave it there, and I'm very happy to take your questions and comments.